and welcome to Carfram's actually first webinar on the opportunities and challenges of naming in Canada's private sponsorship of refugees program. So I want to begin our webinar with land acknowledgement. Today, we are joining this session from different places that are located on Indigenous land. I am a settler to this land. I came to Canada as an international student and then became a landed immigrant. I am currently joining you from Toronto Metropolitan University. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this territory in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The dish, or sometimes it is called the bowl, represents what is now southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec and from Lake Simcoe into the United States. We all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory with only one spoon. That means we have to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it with. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that we must keep the peace. This was a treaty made between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee after the French and Indian War. Newcomers were then incorporated into it over the years, notably in 1764 with the Royal Proclamation, the Treaty of Niagara. So now, as you know, that this event is organized by Carfram's, and this is the first webinar. So before I introduce the topic and our speakers, I now invite Carfram's chair, Dr. Stephanie Stobbe, to say a few words. Before that, I want to introduce our chair, a brief bio. Dr. Stephanie Stobbe is the chair and associate professor in conflict resolution studies at Mennonite College, a college of Canadian Mennonite University at the University of Winnipeg. She is a leading expert on Southeast Asian processes of dispute resolution and has worked all over the world as an educator, trainer, and alternative dispute resolution practitioner. Stephanie is the author and editor of multiple books, including Conflict Resolution and Peace Building in Laos, Perspective for Today's World, and the curator of HOF Stories of Southeast Asian Refugees, Traveling Museum Exhibition. She has served on the American Bar Association team of experts advising the United Nations Development Program Peace Building Support Office on Gender Responsive Peace Building, and as a visiting professor and researcher at the Matsunga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution at the University of Hawaii. Stephanie is a fellow of McGill College at York University and an expert advisory board member for Asia Pacific Refugee Studies at Auckland University in New Zealand, and president of Canadian Association for Refugees and Forced Migration Studies. So now, Stephanie, please say a few words about Carfram's. Thanks.
Thank you for the introductions, Aziz. Good morning, afternoon, evening. It's great to see all of you here today. And as Aziz said, this is our first webinar in our new Canadian Association for Refugees and Forced Migration Studies webinar series. So we're very excited about this. For those of you who are new to Carfram's, the association was established in 2008 to foster an independent community of scholars dedicated to advancing and disseminating Canadian refugee and forced migration research, establishing active partnerships and collaboration among researchers, teachers, practitioners, and advocates, and supporting publications, conferences, and other fora for open communication, dialogue, and networking related to refugees and forced migration studies in Canada and around the world. So for more information, please see our winter newsletter, which is posted on our Carfram's website, so carfams.org. It highlights the various activities and initiatives Carfram's is involved in and includes information on our upcoming in-person Carfram's conference, May 29 to 31st, under the umbrella of Congress of the Humanities and Social Sciences, hosted at York University in Toronto. The conference is titled Racism, Rights, and the Responsibility to Protect. We have an amazing lineup of keynotes, plenaries, documentary films, and other sessions. Some of our speakers include Carolina Hernandez, advisor to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Dr. Elise Van Schleckrecht from Tilburg University, Honorable Justice Isaac Lenaola, Supreme Court of Kenya, among many others. It will also feature a new film documentary called Passage to Freedom, the stories of Southeast Asian refugees and settlement in Canada. So we look forward to seeing you at the conference. We hope that you will be able to join us. And if you are not a member of CARFEMS, please consider getting a membership to connect with scholars, practitioners, and other students and enjoy the opportunities to collaborate on various research, publications, work in the field, and conferences. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Aziz Rahman, our CARFEMS Policy Partnership Officer and member of CARFEMS Executive. He is a research fellow at CERC at the Toronto Metropolitan University. Aziz postdoctoral research examines self-employment patterns of refugees resettled in Canada. His doctoral work examined the labor market outcomes of two groups of resettled refugees, government-assisted refugees, and privately sponsored refugees using the 2016 Canadian Census data. Please welcome Dr. Rahman to facilitate the webinar and introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much. So our topic is today actually naming, which is directly related to privately sponsorship of refugees program. We all know Canada is a leading refugee resettlement country, and we get refugees through 3 resettlement programs, government assisted, privately sponsored, and blended visa office referred programs. According to the actually latest census, 2016 census, we have over 800,000 refugees who landed in Canada between 1980 and 2016. And then now I think we would have more. So out of them, actually, we have 233,340 privately sponsored refugees and 3,060 BORs. So which are actually, these 2 numbers are related to a privately sponsored program. And we'll be talking today about refugees. We'll be learning more from our learned presenters. So now basically I would be asking them to present in 15 minutes, and I'll be sharing their bio as we have their presentations. So today we are having 3 actually academicians or scholars, and 1 practitioner. So Brian Dyck from Mennonite Central Committee, Canada. We have then Ian Haren from McGill University, and Biftu Yousuf from York University. So I'll invite them, and before in presentation, I'll introduce them. So first we are gonna have Brian Dyck. He is the National Migration and Resettlement Program Coordinator at Mennonite Central Committee, Canada, based in Winnipeg. He has been in that position since 2015. Before that, he spent 7 years as the MCC Manitoba Refugee Resettlement Program Coordinator. Brian was chair of the Sponsorship Agreement Holder Association Council from 2011 to 2018. In that time, he co-chaired the NGO Government Committee, a committee of IRCC and SAH council representatives that work at policy and operational issues related to refugee sponsorship. He also has been a consultant to states and NGOs around the world that are looking at starting or adopting a refugee sponsorship program. So he is actually presenting a paper based on a co-authored research paper entitled Naming in the Canadian Private Sponsorship of Refugee Program, Diverse Intentions and Consequences, in the book published in 2020, titled Strangers to Neighbors, Refugee Sponsorship in Context. And the co-author is Dr. Sabina Leher. Sabina worked in various managerial capacities with the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. From 2015 until January 2023, she managed ICS private sponsorship of refugees program and worked with hundreds of community members on resettling refugees to Greater Victoria. Sabine served for 6 years on the Council of the Canadian Refugees Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association and for 4 years on the Executive Committee of the Canadian Council for Refugees. In March 2023, Sabina was appointed to the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, Refugee Appeal Division. Sabina holds a bachelor's degree in economics and sociology, a master's degree in international business administration, and a PhD in educational studies. She also has a postgraduate certificate in refugee and forced migration studies and a certificate in immigration, laws, policies, and procedures. Sabina has written a number of articles and book chapters on immigration-related issues. Now it is your turn, Brian, for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Azizi. And yeah, I'm glad that we had an introduction with Sabina. I was hoping she could be here. I think she would do a way better job at presenting than I would because she's just a smart person, but could not be here. But her slides are a part of this presentation, and of course we worked on the chapter together, which is in the book Strangers to Neighbors, which I think it's a pretty good book, even beyond the chapter that I had, and so encourage you to look at that. But my topic today is going to be about naming, and so I'm just trying to set up this screen so I can see what I'm looking for. Naming is part of the Canadian system, as Aziz said. And today I want to talk a little bit about several things, introducing the concept, a little bit of the history of Canada's PSR program related to naming, and then some key issues. And then I noticed we have a number of colleagues I know from around the world who are part of countries that may or may not have naming as a part of theirs. So Sabina and I in the chapter ended with a little bit of a discussion about considerations if a state or NGOs are thinking about what naming would be. So I want to end with that. But what is naming? And very briefly, it's the ability of a sponsor to nominate someone to be considered for resettling to Canada. And I use the word nominate because ultimately it's a Canadian visa officer who makes the decision as to whether someone is resettled to Canada. But we as sponsors have the option to say we want this particular person to be considered. Now, it's been a contentious issue over the last number of years. Some suggested that it's an erosion of strategic and humanitarian resettlement because selection is not done on those particular pieces, but on other considerations. On the other hand, it responds to what we call the echo effect. And the echo effect is something like somebody comes to Canada and they still have friends or relatives who are refugees. And that echo is the sponsorship that comes after that. So that's one of the things that the naming has allowed for over the last at least 40 years. It also increases the diversity of the resettlement refugees because others other than the state is involved in selection. There are other aspects of introduction to naming, the legal considerations of how it's set up. I mean, we in Canada maybe have not thought so much about that as of late because we have a structure that's been working for many years, but to set up the infrastructure, the legal structures to allow for this can be a complicated thing. There are also the philosophical, or I would almost say teleological considerations. What are the goals of a state or a group to have citizens or permanent residents involved in selection and resettlement? Why are we doing this? That's an ongoing discussion in Canada and probably around the world. And then there's the practical infrastructural considerations in terms of setting this up. It's a complicated thing. And again, we in Canada have been doing it for more than 40 years. So we have the structure set up, but we haven't necessarily, if you're starting from scratch, it can be a problematic thing. Want to quickly run over the system of resettlement in Canada, and focus specifically on two aspects. First of all, selection. So the top line there is focused a little bit on where the selection comes from. And then secondly, resettlement responsibilities. Those are the two aspects of refugee resettlement. Who decides who gets resettled and who's responsible for the resettlement and integration. If you look on the left side, the government-assisted refugees, those are selected by the Government of Canada, usually by UNHCR referrals. On the right hand, private sponsorship is almost always named. Someone as a sponsor says, I want this particular person to be considered for resettlement. And then there are hybrid programs in the middle where the government has made space for sponsoring groups to take on a settlement of a UNHCR usually referred case with incentives, and the incentives are that's a relatively new development in the last, well, it has iterations over the years from the mid 90s on, but the latest one is the blended visa officer referred, and then the very small joint assistance sponsorship program, which by the way, Rachel McNally has just published a paper that was released yesterday on the joint assistance sponsorship. Read that if you want to know more about that. So the questions about selection and responsibility of resettlement keep coming up over and over in the Canadian context. And if you look at the history of involvement, you see that both of those have been a key part of refugee resettlement in Canada. Most of the history, government-assisted refugees have been the most, with a few minor exceptions. And in the last number of years, privately sponsored have been more. So named sponsorships, for the most part, are a big part of what was happening in terms of resettlement since certainly 2016. So this is where we are currently and where we have been over the last 40 years. But it's really important for us to understand where this came from. So I want to spend a little time talking about the history of immigration and refugee displacement in the Canadian context. And to do that, I want to go back to 1945. And I want to acknowledge that I rely a lot on Jeff Cameron's book or work on this. He has talked a lot about, or written a lot about, how various primarily religious groups have been involved in policy in the US and Canada in terms of refugee resettlement. So this, if you want to read more about that, Strangers to Neighbors, the first chapter is by Jeff Cameron, which is excellent. 1945, a lot of displaced people, DPs as they were called in Europe. There needed to be a solution. Many got in what we would call repatriation, or moving back to where they were, or local integration. There were some that didn't have access to solutions, and the Canadian government was looking for ways to be involved in that. The immigration department at the time came up with two programs: close relatives. So if you had a close relative who was a displaced person in Europe, they could be sponsored or brought to Canada. And then there was the other program called the bulk labor. And that was very clearly, they wanted young men to work in the mines and factories and farms and forests of Canada, where they needed more workers. So those are the programs that were in place. But Jeff Cameron talks a little bit about how other groups came into this space and acted as what he calls policy entrepreneurs for humanitarian purposes. So the Canadian Christian Council of Refugee Resettlement established in that time to take some of the people who were being missed by those programs and put a humanitarian spin on those. Canadian Jewish Congress, for example, at the same time lobbied for about 1,000 orphans to be brought from Europe, and the Catholic Immigration Aid Society advocated for non-family refugees to be brought to Canada. So in the context of these immigration programs aimed at vulnerable people, well, at people who were displaced, various actors moved into the space and moved 60,000 people through a sponsorship programs to Canada in a humanitarian. So that, I think, really set the tone for what we have today. It was an important development, and there were contentious times over the years, and I'm going to skip over that for the sake of time. But the next key was the Immigration Act of 1976. And in that, the Canadian Jewish Congress lobbied for refugee sponsorships to be included into the act. And so there is a mention, a very brief mention in the act about refugee sponsorship. Wasn't clarified. That was left to the department, immigration department, to sort out. They started that when the Jewish Immigrant Aid Society, JIAS, and B'nai B'rith wanted to move some Soviet Union, some Jews who were originally from the Soviet Union who were in Western Europe to Canada through a sponsorship program. And so the immigration department looked at that as a test case as to what sponsorship would look like under the Immigration Act. So it was a small number of Soviet Jews who were resettled to Canada in that. At the same time, the World University Services of Canada, WUSC, negotiated agreement to move students. And that was also another significant addition. And that, in fact, program continues today. The next part, though, involves the organization I work for. It was a time when people were seeing a lot of things going on in Southeast Asia. And Mennonite Central Committee, in their annual general meeting report, wrote this very throwaway line called "MCC Canada involvement in the area of immigration continues to be limited." But when the delegates came to the Calgary AGM meeting in January of that year, they had in mind these pictures they were seeing of people in boats. And they told the delegates several things, but I want to focus on the first one and the last one. First, they said, remember the history, because they were involved in the 1940s in moving people from Europe to Canada and elsewhere, some to South America. And so they said that is what we do as an organization. And the fourth piece was to negotiate a sponsorship agreement with the government of Canada. And so just 2 months later, an agreement was signed between the immigration minister and the general secretary of Mennonite Central Committee here in Winnipeg, where I am. And that started really a movement. By the end of the year, there were 40 master agreement holders across Canada working with 7,000 groups. They resettled about 32,000 refugees in the space of 20 months, and most of them were unnamed. So that experience really shaped the way many people saw what the sponsorship program was about. It was about groups getting involved, sponsoring people they didn't know. And that was because that's really what was going on for the most part in 79 and 80. It was short and intense. By 81, it dropped to 4,000, and for the most part stayed that way until 2014 in terms of the number of privately sponsored. And over the years, if you look at the early 1990s, the PSR program began to be a struggle for the government. Frankly, they didn't quite understand it because it would move to this family reunification piece. And so there were a number of reports and discussion papers where they saw this naming as undermining humanitarian selection of refugee resettlement. And so there were concerns about it. However, they recognized it was an important part of the immigration program. In 1995, they talked about it as an unofficial matching mechanism. And at that point, I think there was a significant event because they were seeing the lack of participation in the unnamed sponsorships as more of a logistical problem rather than really a philosophical difference. People were seeing a need for family reunification, and that pull was far stronger than any sort of pull to take people you didn't know. And so that was a disconnect that has happened periodically over the years. Next key event was, of course, the Immigration and Protection Act, which changed the way people with the government talked about refugee resettlement, moving more to protection as the focus rather than integration. And in IRPA, there was a mention about the importance of family reunification. So while it doesn't talk about naming, it does emphasize or at least mention that. Then 2007, 2016, there were more reviews of the program that the government, the Immigration Department periodically does. In 2007, there was no real criticism of naming. So in a sense, there seemed to be coming to a peace with this idea that that's going to be a big part of it. They mentioned that it was a civil society partnership and important to have this. And then finally, there was another review that essentially moved along in those directions. I want to, sorry, I'm getting lost here. Wrap up with a few comments in terms of what naming is about. First of all, it's been a public engagement tool. It's provided more diversity in the resettlement, and it has responded to the echo effect, and it's provided family reunification. But at the expense, some would say, the strategic use of resettlement and a basis of vulnerability and the state's priorities that they have in terms of engagement on the international stage. The state has periodically tried to make the program different by offering these blended incentives to be involved in some things or this allocations or other tools, but it's always been a challenge for the government to get a hold of the private sponsorship, and often they haven't really known what to do with it. In terms of settlement outcomes, it's been an important tool for engagement with the government, with Canadians, and so it has broadened the community engagement. But some would say at the expense of settlement and integration support that is consistent, that a government agency might provide. There have been responses to that in terms of training and support and monitoring and settlement, monitoring of settlements, but it's been a challenge, frankly, for the government to manage this. And just finally, quickly, to talk a little bit about the lessons learned that might apply for other countries. We need to look at sponsor motivations being different in these sort of categories. The level of interest is going to be for naming ongoing, and that's certainly our experience, whereas the unnamed sponsorship might be high initially, but it will certainly wax and wane, and that's been our experience. The control of it is for naming is partially with civil society, and with no naming, it's mostly with the government, and that's certainly an appealing thing for governments, and that's probably why they start there. Then establishing the infrastructure to manage this is a barrier for many in terms of having the naming process. And then finally, protection needs for the refugees. That's something that people often come back to. Is this something that is going to make a difference globally, or is this just something that just family reunification, which is of course important and part of the values. So those are just some of the brief considerations, and I will leave it at that.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian, for your very informative and insightful presentations on the concept of naming, the selection process, the histories, including legal histories. So I know we have questions, but we want you ask questions at the end of all three presentations. And if you want to leave your comments or questions, you can put in the chat box. So let's go to the second presentation. I would like to invite Ian Ben Haren. He's a PhD candidate in sociology at McGill University. His academic research examines migration policy, refugee resettlement, and the experiences of newcomers in Canada, and has been published in Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies, and Migration Information Source. His dissertation focuses on the decision-making processes of individuals involved in refugee sponsorship in Canada. Beyond his academic research, Ian is currently the executive director of Action Refugees Montreal, a small nonprofit that supports individuals seeking protection in Canada. Before starting his PhD, he previously worked for Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada and was responsible for Canada's refugee resettlement programs on the 2 overseas assignments. So now, Ian, yeah, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Aziz, for the introduction, and I'm really delighted to be here today. So, as mentioned, my dissertation research focuses on some of these questions quite closely, how groups make decisions about who they're going to assist when sponsoring refugees. And so the presentation that I'm giving today really comes from that research, not from my current work at Action Réfugiés Montréal. And I am just delighted to be on a panel with both Brian and Biftu. Brian and I first met in 2017 when I was working for the Canadian government in South Africa, and he, as the chair of the SAW Council, was interested in what was happening in resettlement, and we met there. A year later, I attended the conference where Sabina first presented the paper Brian just shared, and I have a copy of the book. I highly recommend it to everyone. And then Biftu and I met for the first time in 2019 at a student conference at York University and talked about our shared interest in refugee sponsorship and have been in touch since then on this topic. So what I'm presenting today are just some preliminary results from my dissertation research. And in a few instances, I also just kind of point towards some of the work that I have already published on some of these issues. The main question that I'm interested in here is how sponsorship groups make decisions about who to assist. And in a few instances, this goes beyond just naming to also looking at, in unnamed sponsorships, how they then decide what they will get involved in. But I think it's important, and my presentation will focus a bit more kind of on the empirical results that I've had so far, to talk about the real variation that occurs in refugee sponsorship in Canada when doing this type of research. Brian has already introduced some of these key terms, but you have different players who are involved in kind of the refugee sponsorship ecosystem in Canada, both long-standing organized organizations that have had agreements with the government for a long time, sponsorship agreement holders, or in Quebec, les personnes morales expérimentées, who kind of have their own systems that they've put in place, but there's also opportunities across the country for individual small groups of 5 citizens in the rest of Canada, 2 to 5 people in Quebec to get involved in sponsorship. There are, we're primarily talking about named sponsorships, but there have been at different times, and Brian mentioned this, particularly in the late 70s and early 80s, sponsorships where the visa office is referring cases, and now there's a blended program where that occurs as well. And so what we have is kind of a variation in kind of the composition of the local groups that get involved in refugee sponsorship. A lot of the published research that has focused on refugee sponsorship tends to focus on 2 specific time periods, either, the one that Brian talked about in the late 70s and early 80s, or really the resurgence of interest in the broader Canadian population around 2015 with Syrian refugees. But we know, and this is the same numbers that Brian had on his presentation, that there has been a long-standing number of communities that have been implicated in sponsorship. And it's important to think about that long history and what was happening between these 2 time periods that received a lot of focus to look at sponsorship. Many advocates within the refugee sponsorship community will say that 90% of the sponsorship, or 90% or higher, depending on who you're talking to, is really extended family sponsorship. But often groups will be composed of kind of a mix of people with personal ties to the refugee who's being assisted and others who may not have those personal ties. So there's just, a wide variety of what this looks like across the country, which makes it, I think, a bit challenging to design a research project, but it's also important to think about this diversity when we're talking about how these types of decisions are made. So returning to my main question, how do these diverse types of groups make decisions about who to assist? This connects to what some sociologists and other social scientists who study migration call the crucial-meso link. So we know that governments might establish a program where it's possible for people to migrate from one place to another, but the question of who ends up migrating through those pathways will be a factor of networks that cross borders, small organizations that get involved in facilitating migration. And that's really what I'm interested in, is kind of on this community scale, how this type of work is done. So in my research to date, I've talked to 50 different individuals who are involved in making these types of decisions, or actively involved in refugee sponsorship. I did the interviews in 2019 and then in 2022. So 7 of the 50 I talked to at both times. Individuals involved in the refugee sponsorship world can be involved at different levels. Sometimes you're both related to someone you're helping, but employed by a sponsorship agreement holder organization. So I've provided here some statistics. 19 of the people I talked to are volunteers or employed at sponsorship agreement holders. 2/3 are involved in local groups. About 1/3 are sponsoring their own family or friends. 1/3 of the people I talked to themselves were refugees who had come to Canada. Half of them were immigrants, 40% were not white, and with a bit of a diversity in age ranges, and looked at a few different provinces. Since this is being recorded and I'm still in the process of doing my analysis, I haven't included any names or specific identifying information in what I'm going to present today, but I'm happy to discuss at other times, more about the sample that I have. And, what we know is that the statistics that we can see on the UNHCR website of 100 million forcibly displaced persons around the world, 30 million refugees, over 1 million people that the UNHCR believes should be prioritized for resettlement each year, the need far exceeds the number of opportunities available. And on a much smaller scale, individuals who have come to Canada but have close ties in refugee situations in other parts of the world have a similar situation that they encounter, where they could provide a long list of who they would like to bring here, but have to make decisions about who they are going to help first. So at the more organizational level, what I heard was it's local community members who have specific ideas about who they want to help. Someone proposes an idea to a small group, the group gets involved, and my question is, so what are they thinking about when they propose that idea, the long list of individuals who they might want to help, who they're going to help first? And what I've found so far in my research is that there are 3 key themes that sometimes explicitly and sometimes more implicitly inform how these decisions are made. And the 3 themes are kinship, vulnerability, and adaptability. I'll provide a short example of each situation, and then we'll talk a bit how these can overlap in different types of situations. So the first thing when talking to people who are motivating groups to get involved in refugee sponsorship is we hear a lot of kinship terms. My sister, my brother, my cousin, my uncle, my parents, my nephew, these are individuals in need of protection. And these are the ones when I would ask questions like, who did you help first? Kinship terms would come up quite frequently. I think there are a few things that are important to keep in mind. One is that in the Canadian context, there is no alternative legal framework or pathway for sibling sponsorship that you might see in the United States, for example. So there's really constrained number of options for supporting family members. And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that kinship terms can mean different things in different cultures. So if we adopted a really legalistic approach in the Canadian context to say, we want to see bloodlines and relationship for these types of terms, that's not necessarily what people mean. And particularly in the context of forced displacement, where family configurations change as you cross borders to flee persecution, these terms can mean different things in different contexts. But one of the sponsors who I spoke with acknowledged kind of the challenge of this by saying, we're not in the process of doing very extended family. I feel selfish that we've stuck only to our relatives, but that's our immediate responsibility, right? And so someone who's motivating a group will have this in mind. There are groups, of course, where kinship is not something that they are thinking about. In the Blended Visa Office Referred Program, it's not a question of who are we connected to already, but in most situations, kinship does play a significant role. And we might even extend the term beyond kinship, and I'm still playing around with what the correct terms are here. Sometimes it is just friendship about individuals who were close personal friends before when individuals were living in refugee contexts. A second important consideration is vulnerability. And here I want to present kind of an excerpt of a conversation that I had with a woman who was explaining to me that both her parents and her husband's parents were Syrian refugees in Jordan. And she says, I was thinking my husband's parents should come first because at least I have a sister here. She's my neighbor. He doesn't have anyone here. But my husband said to me, no, your parents are in a tougher situation in Jordan. And she went on to explain that the current situation was that her parents weren't really able to support themselves financially, whereas her husband's parents had a bit of a better situation living in an urban refugee environment in Jordan rather than in the camp. So here, the logic that was at play within kind of a family context was who is most vulnerable among our extended family. And that is, once we've limited the options, maybe by kinship, a factor that really does become important. The third thing that I heard in my interviews was adaptability. And that can mean adaptability to the local context in particular, or more broadly, adjusting to life in Canada and how the individuals who are facilitating the sponsorship perceive that may occur. So in one context, group that wanted to participate in the Blended Visa Office Referred program, so sponsoring someone who the UNHCR had identified as needing protection, they looked at the potential candidates and they said, a young man in his 20s is not going to stay in our small town, but perhaps a woman in her 40s would be more likely to stay here. So perceptions of who might want to stay in our town or adapt to our day-to-day life here longer term. Another individual who I talked to, who was originally from the Dadaab refugee camp, he first sponsored his immediate family and then got involved in a second sponsorship where he basically said to me, I identified my friends from the secondary school I went to in the refugee camp, thought about who spoke English well and who would do well with some college training in Canada and then be able to support their family back home. So here his interest was very much in who's going to succeed and provide a global benefit in their relocation to Canada once they arrive, very much motivated by adaptability. And in another example that I think shows how complex some of these overlaying levels are, another person that I spoke with mentioned that his mother and 3 brothers were still living in a refugee camp. And his initial impulse was maybe for his mother, who had some health concerns, and his youngest brother to come. But after discussion with the family, he says, we decided it would be better to start with my old brother and younger brother, both of whom finished high school and knew the language. They could integrate easily and get jobs like that. I will not have to put in my time with them to get them oriented to this country. So this transnational family decision where his mother played a strong role ended up prioritizing the siblings who would be more quickly able to adapt to life in Canada. And if I read on in the interview transcript that I had with this individual, also who it was felt really had no prospect in the refugee camp they were currently living in, given the kind of restrictions on employment in the country that they were in. So that's kind of my understanding of how kinship, adaptability, and vulnerability are all factors that are at play in these decision-making processes. It varies depending on the type of group. But what I haven't even talked about here at all is policy constraints. And there are policies implemented by the government that restrict how sponsorship works that also informs decisions. I don't have time to get into this in extensive detail, but as a plug for CARFIMS, I am presenting this paper specifically on policy constraints in more detail in May or late May at the CARFIMS conference. Basically, as there have been restrictions on the number of applications that can be made and strict financial requirements and oversight of groups, that changes how sponsorship groups make decisions about who they are willing to assist. And the complexity and bureaucracy of the system can just deter some individuals from getting involved whatsoever. So it ends up that sponsors with more resources or more capacity to navigate these systems persist, and others may not continue. So to summarize, sponsors have preferences, kinship, vulnerability, and adaptability. This is going to vary depending on the sponsorship, and the design of the program also shapes who's selected. Is this a critique of the decisions that sponsors make? No, I'm not trying to say that sponsorship groups should be making different decisions. They're making rational decisions to provide solutions for individuals that the Canadian government recognizes as refugees in a global context of an insufficient number of protection spaces. So they're making decisions to do good work. I think, if anything, what we need to focus our attention on is increasing the number of protection opportunities for individuals who are in refugee situations. But the findings that I have so far do have some implications, and I'll provide two implications that I think are important to consider. One is that because these selection processes include both a reliance on social networks, you need to have someone in Canada to be selected through this process if it's a kinship connection, and includes a component where the sponsors are thinking who will adapt to life in Canada more quickly. The profile of individuals who come through refugee sponsorship programs are different from those who come through other refugee resettlement programs. And these differences aren't always captured in large, administrative data sets or quantitative data sets. So if you do survey research, you can see a little bit what some of this variation is. And in a paper that focuses on Syrian refugees that I worked on with Thomas Sol, we find, for example, that the percentage of resettled refugees that report poor health is much higher in the UNHCR referred population than in the privately sponsored population. So our sample looked at Syrian refugees who arrived in Canada between 2015 and 2018. We found that 1 in 5 referred by the UNHCR report poor health, 1 in 10 through sponsorship groups. So there is this selection process that ends up that it's less, a smaller proportion of those who are privately sponsored report poorer health. Similarly with language, and this measure is, after being in Canada for a few years, that they report their language ability on, I think we had a 7-point scale, but the percentage that report speaking English or French very well or at a fluent level is much higher among privately sponsored refugees than those that come through programs managed by the UNHCR. There's also big differences on the religious composition if we look at the Syrian population in particular. And so when we're looking at which refugees end up getting jobs or their adjustment to life in Canada, these settlement factors are connected to that. And there have been policy proposals in the Canadian context, particularly by the Conservative government at the federal level, that emphasize better outcomes for privately sponsored refugees that I would argue are often based on research that doesn't fully account for the selection factors that are at play in these procedures. And then finally, I think the second implication is just thinking about the search for protection on a global level. There is a significant emphasis at the UNHCR and other large international organizations on finding additional or complementary pathways to protection, where the Canadian model is being replicated or considered in different contexts, how it can be expanded. And since there is a selection factor that's at play in a process of naming, I think this just needs to be part of the conversation. But as I said earlier, not to diminish this type of program, but just to acknowledge that other programs need to be strengthened as well and to continue onwards. So I really appreciate the funding that I received from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Centre for the Study of Democratic Citizenship, now at the Université de Montréal, and McGill University's Faculty of Arts, and would be delighted to have any comments that you have on my presentation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for your actually empirical research you're conducting and sharing your findings on the decision-making strategies and processes, and also highlighting some of the policy constraints. And now our last presenter, Biftu Yousuf. So I would like to introduce her first. She is a PhD candidate in geography at York University. Biftu received her BA in criminology and holds a double master's in criminology and health sciences from Simon Fraser University. Biftu's research interests lie primarily at the intersection of refugee law, refugee health, and refugee politics. Her dissertation uses feminist geopolitics to explore how racialized sponsors with refugee histories facilitate the resettlement of fellow exiles to Canada. Her Shark-funded project probes Canada's private sponsorship of refugee program and is entitled Invisibilized Provider, the role of racialized diasporas in refugee sponsorship. Her other research interests include critical geographies of race and migration, African diaspora studies, and feminist methodologies. So now it's your turn, Biftu.
All right, thank you, Aziz, for the introduction, and also thanks to Brian and Ian for your presentations. I took a bunch of notes. I've learned a lot of this issue of naming in those particular contexts. So for my presentation, I'm going to take us to a much more specific context of naming and refugee selection. And I just want to apologize to you in advance. I don't have any slides. I hope you'll bear with me as I talk through this. But my research draws from the perspectives of racialized sponsors who have resettled to Canada themselves as refugees. But I do want to underscore that the specificity of this context does not actually signify the extent to which racialized sponsors are involved in Canada's private sponsorship program. And basically what I mean by that is that racialized sponsors with these refugee histories have been central to the sustainability of Canada's private sponsorship program. And I would probably argue too that they're going to be central to the scaling up of Canada's program, both to and within other regions of the world. And if I might be so bold as to say that I would go as far as say, the evolution of the program probably wouldn't be what it is today in the absence of their participation, and particularly these refugee diasporas who have come to Canada from war zones, and even more so who remain impacted by the violence that circulates transnationally. And I think that's an important thing to consider when we're thinking about the element of naming and selection. So keeping this observation in mind as we consider the implications of naming, I think, and as what the implications that naming poses for a group who does a lot of the heavy lifting in the program, but has not always been rendered visible in these critical discussions. So with my presentation, I'm going to just very quickly give you a summary of my PhD research that informs the basis of this presentation. I had planned to get into some of the key debates or some of the key issues, but both Ryan and Ian have done a good job. I might just add a couple of threads to that. Following that, I'm going to describe the methodological framework, and again, in a very brief manner. And then I'll mostly focus on sharing the key findings, so that more of the empirical side of the research before concluding the presentation. So my dissertation explores and documents how racialized diasporas in Canada engage the PSR program to extend refugee protection to fellow exiles. Racialized diasporas is a term that I use to reference a dispersed group dispersed groups rather, made up of former refugees and asylum seekers. Refugee sponsorship has emerged as a real integral part of the lived experiences of these racialized diasporas, but it's been the case that their stories, their roles, their realities, and their experiences in sponsorship have been underrepresented, and particularly in the academic and policy literature. So to this end, the invisibilized perspectives of racialized sponsors is the focus of my research, and the question of naming and refugee selection, and particularly in terms of who, why, and how racialized sponsors select particular refugee profiles for resettlement emerged as a salient issue in my research. So in terms of the research that exists, I think there's, we've heard from Brian how naming has long been a contested practice, and that's been the case since the genesis of the private sponsorship program. And really, I think it also highlights the tensions that have existed between governments and immigration officials and then people on the ground that are doing this work. So I think that's kind of characterized the landscape of the contestations that have existed. One of the ones that is already mentioned as well about the links between naming and family linked cases, and particularly the outpacing, right, of those linked and particularly the family linked cases to relative to unnamed cases, I think has drawn a lot of concern. The PSR program has been understood as a program that has evolved into almost an ad hoc mechanism for family reunification. And there's quite a bit of competing perspectives around even the value of family reunification and using the program to fulfill that kind of purpose. The other issue too that I've seen come up quite a bit that I think helps to contextualize my research is this notion that naming tilts vulnerabilities, the notion of, you know, which migrants are vulnerable away from those who are most in need and towards those that have connections to Canada. And I think the particular tensions there, at least for me, is that it pits, right, vulnerabilities, humanitarian reasons for engaging in refugee protection against families, right, or against linked cases. So around that, questions have come up around that have focused on the questions of equity and questions of fairness that have been embedded in the debates. And really, one of the key ones that I've seen come up is that these spaces to refugee resettlement are in fact scarce. And as we know that, as we just heard from Ian, they are a scarce resource. And that one argument that the scarcity of these resources should be reserved for people either who are most in need, or some have argued that it can be reserved for those who do have connections, but particularly say those familial connections to Canada, because we recognize that the opportunities that affords for integration, the echo effect, and other reasons, other positive reasons, but that other type of broad-based identity connections should not be factored in. So focusing on the familial connections and maybe other reasons around vulnerabilities, but not necessarily based on other connections such as cultural, ethnicity, or religion. And then we've had others that have argued that the naming actually prioritizes, you know, the protection of refugees with connections, and then as a result, it deprioritizes those that don't have a connection, right? So it's really complex. It spans many landscapes, and I think it's been interesting to see, and very thoughtful, right, to see the issues that have been framed and in quite different ways. So part of what I try to do in my research, just in general, but even on the issue of naming, is to scale down the understanding of what naming is, how naming is exercised as a practice, what it means in the context of like the broader context of protection and whose notion of protection and whose notions of vulnerabilities. And so I do this by scaling down these issues to draw out these unique perspectives from racialized sponsors, mind you, who have these dual positionalities of being former refugees and having those lived experiences, but then also participating and engaging in Canada's sponsorship program to extend refugee protection to other exiles. And so instead of focusing on more of a state or a policy-centric perspective, my research centers the lived experiences and the subjectivities of displaced peoples, displaced communities, and that's what a feminist politic of a security would necessitate. And it's a way of understanding that protections to persons and communities that are affected by displacement might actually be a productive avenue for making visible their own sense. So these communities' own sense of what security and safety means. But it's also a way to just claim back these protection discourses away from state-centric perspectives. So in terms of the methodology that I used, or just the landscape of my research design, just very briefly, as I conducted 28 semi-structured in-depth interviews with both racialized diasporas and key informants who resided in Alberta, British Columbia, and Ontario. So I used a combination of a purposive sampling technique that was also coupled with the participant driven, or otherwise known as a snowball sampling technique, to solicit participants both from informal networks as well as formal networks. And the primary goal that was driving me when I was undertaking qualitative data analysis was really just to analyze the data, but to draw out patterns and to draw out key themes and insights that would clarify my overarching research questions. But it is a qualitative project, so the nature of the research was quite exploratory. It was grounded and definitely open-ended. And so the conclusions that I draw are definitely contextually specific, and they are reflective of participants' own perspectives embedded within their own social context. So, and my findings also build on knowledge that was produced out of a research project that I was involved in with Professor Jennifer Heinemann. And so we have published around that, and some of it does look at this issue of naming and selection in the family-linked cases. And so it does also just build on that work as well. And so what I want to primarily focus on today are two issues. I had hoped to also talk about the strategies, but there's not enough time. But the first theme being the choices, around the choices. So the issue of, as we heard Ian present, who are the refugees, or who are the profiles that these sponsors elect or choose to resettle. And so I'm working with this idea that refugee selection is quite hybridized. At least that's how it's come up in this research, in the sense that this group is not only sponsoring family-linked cases that are even just named, but they also sponsor strangers, and that kind of looks different in two different. It's come up in two different ways. So although there exists this implied notion that racialized diasporas almost solely support the sponsorship of named refugees, and building on that, in particular family-linked cases, my research finds that they're also resettling refugees that don't have family or don't have other personal links to Canada. And so some of the things that my participants expressed, both who were individuals that were a part of a SAW, sometimes they led a SAW, sometimes they were just a part of the volunteer group, but also I interviewed people who were involved in more ad hoc arrangements of sponsorship. So that can look like many different many different dynamics. And one of the things that emerged in relation to sponsoring the stranger is sponsoring refugees who have been identified because they are high profile cases. And so what this typically look like is a reference that they would make to refugees who have been these human rights defenders that have essentially stood up and stood out for the rights of others and were being persecuted or experiencing violence on that basis. So for these participants, these refugees are selected because of what they perceive to be heightened vulnerabilities, and often became aware of these particular profiles through the media, or what I'm referring to as transnational refugee support networks, so mostly from people abroad. In the words of one SAW participant, they explained that 50% of their allocations are actually reserved for these type of cases and from referrals from refugees abroad. The second dynamic is linked to, so mostly with these cases, also the high profile cases, it tended to be for people who did share a country of origin or an ethno-national identity. So just to be clear about that. The other element of the stranger was actually facilitating the sponsorship of refugees who were linked to other sources of violence or other sources of persecution or displacement. So I did find this to be kind of pretty fascinating, especially tying into those arguments about the scarcity of resettlement, that they would use some of their scarce resettlement allocations and actually extend that as a source of protection for other diasporas. And so one participant had explained how they had resettled, I think it was about 5 refugees who were from the Yemeni community, and said, hey, these are not individuals that we're connected with. One of them has a relative here who's gotten in touch. and we have a sense of what's happening in Yemen. And so we sponsored, and more so than that, this is what we want the future of their type of sponsorship to just demonstrate in their work. This participant also explained that their entire mandate for sponsorship, despite it being focused on a very particular diaspora that they identified with, was actually, their mandate was meant to be inclusive and working towards like broadening, right, their sponsorship landscape to include not just one particular group. And in their own words, they said, we're acting like other organizations like Catholic Social Services or the Mennonite Central Committee who helps different people, right? So really trying to broaden that landscape of being inclusive to and being galvanized by extending protection to fellow exiles, even in the absence of a shared country of origin or identity. The other element of who they select, of course, is relatives. And I don't think I have to say much about that. That exists already. There's a lot in the literature that exists around, you know, how that dynamic of sponsorship features. But what I think was interesting is the notion of ethno-national kin. So a lot of times, you know, even when, you know, so putting the family and the relatives, you know, if we're using the legalistic definitions by marriage or by blood, but it also included this notion of kinship based on an ethno-national identity, but specifically to underscore that it was to extend protection to kin, ethno-national kin, who themselves were in need of safety and protection. And so Professor Hyman and I have actually just, the book was just released yesterday, produced a chapter on this notion of ethno-national kinship and explain it as this transnational bond that refugee diasporas maintain with people who remain displaced and unprotected and often in dangerous situations. So they were quite expressively focused on mobilizing grassroots or ad hoc sponsorship groups and using a part of their allocations to protect this broader group of kin that were displaced by the same source of violence that they themselves have experienced. And oftentimes this violence was still ongoing, okay? So that was one feature there. With respect to motivation, so that's the second theme, my research finds three distinct dynamics of what motivates these sponsors to get involved in sponsorship, but also to name the specific refugee profiles that they are committed to sponsoring. One was the notion of just broad concerns about human rights and being deeply concerned about the suffering of people that have been displaced by violence. And we can see how that would apply, you know, to more broadly to all exiles, refugees who are living in exile and not just specific groups that are being identified. I don't have time to read through the quotes, but ultimately to say that that it was their own experiences and subjectivities of being people or having been a displaced migrant that really galvanized them to mobilize their supports. And one quote that really stood out for me is what, you know, when one participant had said, you know, my motivation, my primary push is to save people from dangerous situations. And of course, that was the desire when I came here. If not for me, then who would know what it means to be in their situation? They don't need to explain to me how terrible their situation is and how much they suffer. We just know, I know what it means to be there. And if there's a chance, then I should be the first person to answer their call. So a lot of the sentiments around this notion of being motivated by human suffering stems from that issue. Or stems from their direct perspectives and their direct lived realities of being displaced. The other part, the other theme, and I will wrap it up here just in 2 minutes, but was this idea that there was this political necessity to act. So I think this really stood out as a distinct source of motivation that stemmed from their recognition that refugee protection in itself, so or even just in the landscape of Canada here, is inequitable. It is not something that is accessible to all refugees in an equal way. So what participants, you know, I guess, raised as worries and concerns around this was that in particular, refugees from the continent of Africa have all but been forgotten. And so in their view, which is also backed up, by research that's been conducted that lists, the top 10 countries that have forgotten displacement crises as all being located in Africa. So with this, participants were concerned that if the government was not able or other groups were not mobilizing in a systematic, in an intentional fashion to support these refugees in Africa who have been forgotten, then it was their job to step in and to do this. So I think what this underscores is that participants are driven by a political necessity to act, and naming essentially gives them that leverage or that ability to step in and to fill this gap or to make that landscape more equitable in the way that they see it. The final theme in terms of motivation is being haunted by family separation. So this ties back to why they, elect to sponsor family members and ethno-national kin. Separation is a definite motivating factor. We know that family unity, although it is protected by various internationally recognized rights, it's not always guaranteed that refugee families will remain intact. They are routinely separated and are dispersed across distant geographical borders, and oftentimes for undetermined periods of time. Research obviously has shown that family separation and the uncertainties about reunification can itself be a source that exacerbates the vulnerabilities of migrants. So I won't read the quotes here, but really just to say that participants, being haunted by themselves, right, as being sponsors who have experienced family separation, but also their community's experience of separation, and being able to step in and to leverage the naming mechanism to be able to bring essentially what one participant said, but to make families whole again. And so just to conclude with 2 sentences here, I think what we can do when we're scaling the question of naming down to these individuals and these communities that are affected by displacement, we're learning these new insights that the hybridity of refugee selection really does invites us to really question this notion, these essentialist notions, right, that they're only sponsoring a very select kind of, refugee profile and using only the mechanism to do like linked and named sponsorship. It looks quite varied than that. And the naming mechanism has also allowed them to, mobilize and to build bridges across diaspora communities here in Canada, and to sponsor ethno-national kin as a matter of a human right. And I will leave it at that. I think I've gone way over time, so thank you. You could, I'd be happy to hear from you in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Biftu, for your again, very exciting research, like Ian, and we have seen some similarities and dissimilarities. So we'll be actually having now 16 minutes for questions and answers. And